This
Yeah.
conference will now be recorded.
Okay.
Darryl,
So the
Darryl,
current. Yes. Sorry.
I've got a couple of questions. Do you want me to do those, or do you want to start off first?
Yeah. Far away. Start with the questions
Right.
first. Not a problem
Okay.
at all.
Right. So the first one: how should I respond to a tenant due to arrive in September, currently abroad, who was asked to be relieved of her contract if she cannot get here in September? She wants to wait and see what happens.
Well, at the moment, people can fly in and fly out. So the UK hasn't shut its borders. So UK legislation hasn't stopped someone from flying in. I fully accept her country may stop people from flying out. So that's an issue for her country and not the UK. The UK, as I understand it, as of today, is they're still accepting flights in and flights out. So in that sense, if a tenant can't fly here, that's not an issue for the UK or English and Welsh law. Obviously, if she can't get here, it depends on whether it's a joint tenancy or not. It doesn't say, does it? So it doesn't say, Ruth, whether it's a joint tenancy or not. But if they've signed a contract and everyone's signed it and it's starting in September, then for someone to be released from that contractual obligation, you've got to get the agreement of everyone. So that's the situation ultimately. But as you say, it's going to have to be a sort of wait and see scenario. We're only end of April. So I fully accept a lot can happen between now and September. So again, as I said, a lot of water will pass under the bridge by that date. So at the moment, I think it's a wait and see scenario.
It's not a joint tenancy.
It's a single tenancy, is it? Sole tenancy. So yeah, it's entirely up to the landlord then, landlord and tenant. If the tenant says, look, I can't get here and I'm not going to start in September, then the landlord can go, fine, I'm happy to cancel that contract. If that's what Ruth wants to do, it's entirely up to Ruth ultimately. It's no different to if it was the other way around and Ruth was Ruth was saying, look, actually my circumstances have changed and I need to sell the property, or my circumstances have changed and I've got to move into the property. Do you mind cancelling this contract? Then it's down to the tenant to say yes or no. So it works both ways in that sense. In this occasion, the tenant's coming to her and saying, by the way, my tenancy, I might not be able to get here in September. Can I cancel the agreement? And that's entirely down to Ruth and what she wants to do.
Next question is, I have a student property in Beeston. One student has asked to be released from her contract early. It is due to end at the end of July. I rely on this income as I have no other source of income to cover the bills and outgoings with regards to this property.
Yeah, I mean, Elaine, we're going to cover this as we go through the slides, but ultimately a joint tenancy is a joint tenancy. So if there's rent payable, then rent is payable. There is nothing in legislation that stops someone moving into a property or moving out of a property. There's nothing in the legislation that says any tenancy that was agreed has to be cancelled. Because the tenant is not, or because the student is asking, the student wants to leave.
Sorry, it's a single tenancy as well.
Oh, was it a single? Okay,
yeah.
So yeah, very similar to Ruth's question then. Exactly the same. Yeah, sorry, Elaine, same here. Yeah, because it's a single tenancy, then the same applies. Because the tenant doesn't want to live at the property, that's her decision, no one else's. I fully appreciate, I accept there are probably very good reasons as to why she doesn't want to live at the property, but ultimately, she has the legal right to do so. The law's not stopping her living there. She's made that decision herself not to live at the property. But we'll cover that in future slides. So it's entirely up to you, Elaine. But obviously, if someone can't afford to pay the rent, then I think from a realistic position, you may have to consider some form of agreement regarding ending that tenancy now. So, for example, you could say to her, would you accept me keeping the deposit and we can end the tenancy today? You might be able to find someone else for the property. I don't know. But you may say, actually, Darryl, I can't find anyone at all. There's no one looking. So it's one of those situations, sadly, where there's no easy answer, which is going to solve your problem entirely. Unless, as I said, you find a replacement tenant who's prepared to live there. But again, you may have another tenant lined up for September. Is that fair, Elaine? You may not, actually. So that's the situation ultimately, Adila. But let's go through the
Another
slides
question.
quickly, then we're
Oh, okay, you go. Oh, well, you go first, then I'll do GoPals after.
we'll go through the slides. It's just really saying, and this particular slide that you're seeing, it's ultimately it's saying the current status is that nothing really has changed from a tenancy perspective. The rent is still 100% contractually due. Most universities, well, I think all universities are still open in the sense that they're still providing a service to their students. They're just doing it online. Maintenance grants are still being paid. I think they were paid on April the 20th, from someone was saying. So all of those things are still happening. The only difference in most cases is that someone is now living at home, as in their parents' home or their hometown, rather than the student town. So they're all saying as students, oh, by the way, we're not going to, we don't want to live at your property anymore, so therefore we're not going to pay you any rent. Well, sadly, there's a contract which very clearly defines that rent is payable. Now, I fully accept that's the hard line position to take if you want to go down that route, but ultimately that is the legal position. As I said, it's no different to the other way around. If circumstances dictated that the landlord had to there was issues where the landlord actually said to the tenant, I've got to move back in because my circumstances have changed. The student tenant is entitled to say no. We've agreed a contract till July. I don't want you moving back in. So it works exactly. It works both ways in that sense. As I said, from a student perspective, and I think Martin Lewis of Money Saving Expert has nailed this on the head. This is a I won't pay situation rather than a can't pay situation. So that's ultimately what's happening. Is that actually they've got the money in most cases still. Most of them are still getting their maintenance grants. I fully accept some of them have part-time jobs, etc., which they can't do. So therefore, their finances have changed slightly. I accept that. But the majority of them out there, their finances will be exactly the same. They'll still be getting their maintenance grants. I don't know if actually you can hand back your maintenance grant, can you? I don't know if you can. I assume you probably can. So actually, I don't want my maintenance grant this month, this term, because I don't need it. Now, I'll be very surprised if any of those students actually say that. They may do. I don't know. I don't know if anyone knows if any student said that. I don't want my maintenance grant. I'd be very surprised if any of them would do that. And in most cases, most of them, I mean, again, what can you actually do at the moment? You can't actually spend a lot at the moment. So I'm not too sure what they would be spending their money on. So ultimately, I don't think this is a cash flow issue. This is all about them saying, because I'm not living at the property, or I don't have full use of the property because for whatever reason, I am not going to pay. Well, sadly, that may seem unfair to an extent, but ultimately the landlord is still providing facilities to you. It's your decision as the student not to live at a particular property. And a number of people mention legally, is the contract frustrated? I think there's another one that people force major. There's something that's happened that stops us living there. There isn't. The house hasn't burnt down. The house isn't flooded. There's no law that's stopping you going there. So ultimately, the contract is still 100% valid in that sense. So what are the options? Again, rent is still due. If you want to, you can follow the rent arrears process, and you can pursue the tenant and any guarantor. I assume the guarantors, most of you will have guarantors. So the guarantor is the person who you would ultimately chase. I fully accept you're probably discussing this with guarantors already. But yeah, it's no different to any contractual obligation. A guarantor most likely will be a homeowner, most likely will have a mortgage. Again, mortgage companies aren't saying we're going to let you off the mortgage payment. What they may be saying is we'll let you defer the mortgage payment until the end of the term. So they just have a 3-month holiday. They're still obligated to pay. They just pay it at the end of the term. So they still pay the money due. They will just pay it potentially a number of years later. And in most cases, they will be paying more interest for that as well. So mortgage companies are giving payment holidays, but they're not letting people off. So it works exactly the same as a landlord. If you wanted to give someone more time to pay the rent, then fine, you can do that. But as I said, from a student perspective, this isn't a matter of I can't pay. This is a matter of that I actually won't pay because I don't think I need to. Well, sadly, Mr. Student, you are obligated to pay. Now, I fully accept you can negotiate with your landlord. In some senses, good landlords, which I know a lot of MPO landlords are good landlords, are most definitely going to potentially have a conversation with the tenants about rent holidays or rent deferments or even rent deductions, which I know lots of you would have done already. So I don't know if anyone's been really kind and let them off the whole rent for the term, but you can do that as well. Entirely up to you as the landlord, depending on your circumstances. But as someone was saying earlier, if you rely on that money to be able to live, then sadly you're going to have to play hardball. But as we know, it's easy to play hardball. It's a lot harder to get the money out of the tenants, because if ultimately they won't pay, what can you do in the current circumstances? There's not a lot you can do apart from putting pressure on the tenant and any guarantor. Obviously, you can deduct from the deposit if you wanted to at the end of the tenancy. So you would have to wait until the tenancy's ended and then try a deduction. And if more money's owed than the deposit held, then you could start a money claim through court against the tenant and the guarantor. But just be wary of that at the moment the court system is somewhat overloaded, in the sense that a lot of the court hearings have been cancelled. The whole system is sort of ground to a halt. So I would expect when it's up and running again, probably sort of maybe July, August, September time, there's going to be a lot of cases going through court. So if you're chasing possession or chasing rent arrears, you might have quite a long wait. As I said, these are some of the options I was saying earlier. So rent holiday discount, agree a payment plan, whatever you're going to be doing. It just needs to be very informal in terms of what you're trying to achieve. So you don't have to write an all singing and dancing contract for it. Just a very simple email from you as the landlord to say, oh, by the way, I'm happy for you to pay the rent at a later stage if that's what you want to do. That's a very simple email. Or you could say, I'm happy for there to be a £200 deduction per person per month for the next 3 months. You don't have to write a new contract. A very simple email from you as the landlord would suffice in proving what's been agreed between parties. So a simple email or addendum would be sufficient. You don't have to write War and Peace. Just be mindful of the guarantors as well. So if you're having discussions in that sense, just make sure you copy all the guarantors in and say, by the way, this is what's happening. And exactly the same with this option here, that you've been really kind and you're not going to allow them any rent, you're going to allow them all the rent off. Then again, a very simple addendum or an email confirming that fact to the tenant and the guarantor would be simple enough to prove that that's what you've agreed to as a landlord. So you don't have to spend too much time trying to write detailed correspondence. Just a very simple email saying, by the way, there is no rent due for June, July and August, and I expect you not to pay it at all. It's not owed whatsoever. I'm completely writing that off as a landlord. That would be sufficient in relation to proving that's what you've agreed with the parties. Other issues which I just wanted to make you aware: if you're going to play hardball and you're not going to negotiate whatsoever in relation to a tenancy in terms of a rent reduction, then just be wary that ultimately you need to make sure that all your compliance is in order, your deposit compliance, whatever it's going to be, because if you do play hardball and the tenant takes advice or the guarantor takes advice, etc., etc., then you're going to find lots of people going to seek legal advice. Has my landlord acted correctly in the first place, in relation to how they've created the tenancy, how they've dealt with deposit compliance, how they've done repairs correctly? All those things will come to the fore if you're not prepared to negotiate, I would assume, because I've already had a couple of people ask me regarding this from a tenant perspective. So tenants are on the lookout in relation to be able to get off the hook. So just make sure that all your paperwork is in order. The future tenancy part is about September again. at the moment, we're not too sure what's going to happen in September. But the nearer we get to September, without the situation changing, I suppose a lot of it will depend on whether the universities are offering physical tuition in September, which I assume they will be, because there's lots of discussion about smaller class sizes, that type of scenario, splitting up the classes into, so there's the ability to self-distance, etc. So I would assume probably that the universities will be open in September. Joint liability, as I said, from a tenancy perspective, if you're going to, on a joint tenancy perspective, if you're going to end someone's liability or whatever it's going to be, don't forget that whole tenancy is jointly and severally liable. So you can't treat individual tenants within a joint tenancy different unless they all agree to it. So if someone wants to pay less and someone's still paying the same amount, they've got to agree to that. You can't start treating individual tenants within a joint tenancy differently unless they've all agreed to that. Otherwise, you're leaving yourself a little bit wide open. And from a landlord perspective, and if you're using an agent, and if you've agreed a discount in their rent, just be wary. Some agents would still expect you to pay their commission as agreed, which is a fair assumption. If you're going to reduce the rent and they get less money, it's not their fault that's happened. So just be wary that some agents would expect you to pay their commission as agreed and not at the reduced reduced rate, shall I say. The next one is just about future students, and again, as I said, I've already sort of touched on this already. They've signed a tenancy, so the tenancy starts as agreed. If they don't come and pick the keys up, that tenancy still starts. So just for them, if they want to pull out, they need to negotiate that with you. And as I said, if it's a joint tenancy, they all need to agree. So otherwise, the tenancy does start as agreed, irrespective of whether or not they pick those keys up. Picking a set of keys up doesn't mean a tenancy doesn't start. It just means that the tenant is unwilling to collect the keys. Well, if that's what they're doing, that's their fault, not yours as a landlord. And as I said, all tenancies are not linked. Well, any tenancy is not linked unless you make it linked to the university starting. So a student tenancy is no different to a family tenancy. There's nothing on that tenancy, I assume, which makes any reference to the university, probably. You could in future, and I think some people may ask, they might actually say, actually, this tenancy will be linked to me having a physical course to go on to at the university. Now, if that's a condition of the tenancy in it starting, then that's fine. But I'm not aware of anyone that's done that previously, but you may get the odd person that asks that, says, actually, I'm not going to sign an agreement unless there's a condition attached that it doesn't start unless I have physical tuition at the university that I'm moving to. So it's one of those awkward ones which may pop up from time to time. I'm not aware of anyone doing it yet, but that may pop up. Again, just as I said, future students, repairs and maintenance. Again, as I said, if you're going to go into a property, then you've got to obviously take into account self-distancing protocol. You should only do repairs and maintenance if they are urgent. Again, with the check-in, I don't know how many of you physically move tenants in, but again, you need to bear in mind checking the inventories in terms of self-distancing, etc. Holding deposits, again, just be mindful of that. If you're going to deduct from a holding deposit because the tenant's pulled out, then you need to show evidence that that's the cost that you've incurred. So again, that may not be so relevant to you guys in terms of September. I don't know when holding deposits are taken for students, but if you took a holding deposit early and a student now wants to pull out and they haven't signed a tenancy agreement, then you may be able to deduct from that holding deposit if necessary. And again, with guarantors, as I said, I think they're going to be the biggest issue. I think in most cases, guarantors will be the ones that are querying the reasons as to why you're not negotiating a discount, etc. So guarantors are an important part of the whole negotiation process. And that's pretty much me done in terms of my slides, Adina. I went through them really quickly because I know we will probably have quite a few questions. if you're there,
Um,
there a dealer.
yeah, there's more comments.
Fine,
I think
comments are good.
someone wanted to ask a question. There was John who wanted to ask a question. John Gibbons.
Yeah, hello, yeah.
Yeah.
Hiya. Just quick one on deposits. When my tenants paid some of their deposit back in January, and I put that in, and then they paid the remainder in April when they got their loan. Do you have to redo the prescribed information again? So you do it twice?
Yes, you do. I mean, every time you take a part payment, John, you have to issue prescribed information. So
I have to sign it again, yeah?
yeah, sadly, I mean, I personally would just say to them, just for your own protection or to mitigate the risk to you, I would probably just say to them that pay me the deposit when you've got the deposit in its entirety. I had one the other day, they took part payments and they forgot to protect one part. So I would just say for your own sanity, you may say to me there's a very good reason that's why we take part payments, but from a sanity perspective, I would always say to landlords or agents, only take a deposit when it's the full amount. I wouldn't take part payments, John.
It was more the case of securing the property effectively. They believe they've paid the deposit, so they believe they've got the property. And then we also believe that they're taking the property because they've paid that money. It's a bit different than it was years ago because like I said, now it's just a holding fee effectively. So I generally call it a holding fee at the beginning, and then say to them, once you paid the remainder, I then put that all in as one deposit.
So you protect the holding fee, is that right?
No, if they do a holding, I don't know, did you have to do that? But if they do a holding fee, so if they give me say £100 each in January,
fine. You can
that's a
hold
holding
that.
fee. And then basically, if they pull out, then obviously I've done any referencing or any of them, like I said, might come off that. But generally, if they don't, then they pay the rest of the deposit in April when they've got their loan in, and then I use that holding fee and that remainder deposit money they paid.
Yep, fine.
And then
yep. But you only have to protect You only have to protect the deposit in May or whenever it's last paid. So the holding fee that you take initially is the holding fee. I think the holding fee that I provide says that you can hold that holding fee for a minimum or a maximum of 15 days or until the tenancy starts. That's a way of doing it. So you don't have to protect that part. So long as you get them to sign to say that that's what they've agreed to, that's fine. And then when they pay you the remainder of the deposit in April or May, then that's when you can protect the whole deposit. So that's what I would do.
Okay. And then the other question was, do you think, as in chasing money down on things like money claim online, that's still part of the court proceedings? That'll take a while.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to take a while if the tenant doesn't reply. But ultimately, if they reply and say, I don't agree to this, which lots of people will do, then yeah, you've got to go through the court process, and that's going to take. I saw one the other day. I mean, we've got, I think I might have mentioned it before, but in terms of possession, I had a client who's been going through court under a Section 8 for about 8 months. They had a court hearing scheduled for March the 14th. It was cancelled. They've rescheduled it to be listed for October the 30th. That's just to be relisted. So that's not the hearing date. That's the date that the courts will relist it for another date. So I don't expect them to see the inside of a courtroom until sometime in 2021 at the earliest. And that's a court process that has already started. So I think if you start a money claim, say June, July, August, I'll be very surprised if you see the inside of a courtroom until the middle of 2021 would be my estimation, sadly.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's grand. Yeah. Thank you.
Anything else, dealer? Or we?
No other questions coming through.
Are there still comments? Are they? Fine. I mean, as I said, this was run for the benefits of your members. So hopefully, if there's not many questions coming through, then I assume you've answered them previously, or they've sort of been answered on the webinar. I'm just going through the chat. I mean, I mean, so it just seems to be Gopal and Linda talking about stuff. So, out of interest, then, I mean, you've got 30 people on the course. How many of you have actually negotiated a discount?
I've sort of said, yeah, I've sort of said that I'll give them back their utility bills. Because if I start just doing one, because I know as you, if I give one discount, I'll give it to everybody. But I will give back the utility bills I haven't used, and stuff like that. But I have been paid the majority. I've been pretty lucky. There's probably only about 5 or 6 that owe me money, so it's not too bad.
What about the others? If anyone else wants to stick their head up, you don't have to say anything. You can just write.
Yeah, hi Daryl. This is Martin. How are you? Okay.
Hi, Martin.
Yeah, so Daryl's question. So, with bills inclusive, are we legally obliged to refund any utilities if they're not being used?
Not if it's inclusive. So if you just say it's £100 a week, I don't know how you state your rent, but if you say it's £100 a week, then inclusive, that's fine. That's what they pay. If you said it's £80 a week plus £10 a week for the electric, gas, and for fair usage, then I would argue actually if they're not there living there, you're going to get utility bills which are a lot lower than you would normally get. So therefore, you would have to refund that money, I would argue. That's how I would argue it as a tenant. So actually, I'm paying you £10 a week, and we're not even using 1p a week because obviously we're not there. There might be a standing charge situation, but beyond that, I would say that if you charge separate to your rent, then you would have to repay the tenants, would be my argument.
We don't charge separately, no. It's all included within that, say, £100 a week per person.
Yeah, all in. Yeah. That's fine. Yeah, all in. That's it.
So no legal obligation to refund any of it, no?
No, not at all. None whatsoever.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks.
I think a few people are coming back in terms of what they've negotiated. Some are waiting. Neil said 20% for bills that they've moved out, 50% if lost jobs and been longer term. Good tenants.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think a lot of landlords are negotiating discounts because they understand that a lot of people aren't living at properties. But for those that rely on the income because it's their money they need to live on, which I fully understand that everyone's in the same boat to an extent, then you're still expecting that money. And I think the hardest thing, especially for someone like Ruth, is how are you going to force them to pay if they won't pay? Because what leverage do you have? You have very little leverage at the moment, sadly.
Well, my husband, he's going to send out letters from a solicitor because he's getting a few of his students now who are really messing about and saying they're just not going to pay. So he's been talking to one to get a letter sent out, and I think he'll pursue it. And it might not be yet, but he will still pursue it.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I just think tenants are very aware now that the whole process is stacked in their favour. So the whole process is going to be quite lengthy, quite costly, quite from a stress level perspective, that sense. So I think the clever tenants out there know that they've got the better hand, so to speak, in relation to a landlord and tenant relationship. But yeah, ultimately, yeah, legally, you are entitled to the money. If you pursue them through court, they've got to have a very good reason as to why they shouldn't pay. And that's why I referred to earlier the compliance, because they're the things that I would be looking at if I was the parent of a student. I'd be saying, okay, fine, if you want to pursue the rent, which is your contractual obligation to be able to do so, then I'm going to make sure that you've done everything correct in relation to deposit protection, prescribed information, scheme leaflet, deposit repairing obligations, all those things I would be looking at. Again, even the guarantors, lots of agents out there or lots of landlords out there don't get guarantors signed up correctly. So again, are they the things that guarantors would be looking at in terms of wriggling out?
Sorry, can you just go over that guarantor? Because I heard it last time and it was something I didn't even realise. So
yeah, the basic principle in signing guarantees or guarantors is the guarantor doesn't get any benefit. If I'm a guarantor, as a general position, I get no benefit. What's the benefit to me of being a guarantor? What pleasure, if that's the right way of saying it, do I get out of being a guarantor? There's none at all. Well, there is some, sorry, but in majority cases, it's quite hard to explain what pleasure or what benefit a guarantor gets out of being a guarantor. So to be a guarantor, to be a valid guarantor, ultimately the guarantor must always sign before the contract is signed. So for me to be a guarantor, the benefit that I get of being a guarantor is that the landlord or letting agent then offers or then agrees a contract with the person that I'm guaranteeing. So for a guarantee to be valid, it must always be signed before the tenancy. Before the tenancy signed. Because in the end, if I sign after the tenancy signed, what benefit am I getting? None at all, because the tenancy has already been agreed before I sign as a guarantor. So all those things will come into play. I'm not saying guarantors will be that clever or understand it, but they're the things that I would be absolutely testing to the legal limit in relation to the legal validity of a guarantee. So I know lots of guarantors who sign way after a tenancy agreement's been signed. Well, that's invalid. The basic principle, there is no benefit to a guarantor signing it, because, well, if I don't sign it, you've already given them a tenancy, so it makes no difference whether I sign that guarantee or not. So just be wary of that, because
So Daryl, if that's the case, does that mean that if you go after the guarantor, they can refuse to pay?
Yeah, well, there's no guarantee
because they signed it afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. That's my argument. I would test it in court. I'm not saying every single judge would agree to it. It's all about interpretation, etc., etc. But that's the basic principle of a guarantee. If you wanted to stand guarantor for your son or daughter, dealer, you're doing it. Why? Because you want that agent or landlord to offer a tenancy to your son and daughter. Is that not correct?
Yeah, of course.
Because your son or daughter said, look, that agent won't offer me a tenancy unless you, as a dealer, stand as guarantor. And you'll go, fine, because I know you would. You will stand guarantor for your two children. I know you would. So you would go, okay, fine. I'm happy to sign guarantor. Let me read the agreement. Fine, understand the agreement. Let me sign to say that I'm going to be guarantor. That is a valid guarantee. Now, if that's signed after the tenancy, well, what are you guaranteeing? You can't retrospectively guarantee a tenancy.
Yeah, hi Daryl, it's Martin again. Sorry, but
Martin.
It doesn't mean that the tenancy isn't valid. It's still just because it was signed after. I mean, you can still take the students to court, though, couldn't you?
Correct.
You can still pursue it.
Yeah. The tenancy agreement is still 100. The tenancy agreement is not relevant to the guarantee being valid.
No.
The tenancy, as you've already said, Martin, is 100% valid. But just be wary. They're the things that I would look for if a friend came to me and said, "Look, Daryl, this agent's chasing, or this landlord's chasing me for £5,000 that my daughter owes in university." The first thing I would be saying is, give me deposit compliance documentation, because I want to make sure that's all in order. If that's all in order, let's have a look at the guarantee to make sure that was signed correctly. They're all the things that solicitors, legal advisors will all look at, because with the greatest respect to landlords and letting agents, a lot of them get it wrong. Hence why it's so important what MPO does about training, education, etc., etc. But it's these things that will pop up, and you go, "Well, I never knew that." Well, sadly, that's no protection in court, or no defence in court.
Yeah, Ruth made a really valid point. We've got a local MP who's campaigning on behalf of students not to pay rent. So basically, because the university has said no rent's due, and also Unite have decided not to charge rent, the MPs jumped on the bandwagon. So I think that's causing a lot of problems for the landlords.
All I can say is that's periphery. Whether the universities charge rent, whether the MPs got involved contractually, that's what they're obligated to pay. So sadly, there's been obviously a seismic shift in what's happened, but sadly that's not the fault of the landlord.
Yeah, well, could I ask, what are the forms that you would have to have filled in then, just so I can double check on this? So you'd have to have, before starting tenancy, when you're sending out for a tenant, you do your how to rent, you send them an EPC.
Yeah, I mean, they're not overly important, John, for student lets, because you don't really serve Section 21. So the how to rent guide, the EPC, the gas safety, even though they are important, especially the gas safety, they don't really affect the obligation to pay rent.
Right,
so
okay, yeah.
What obviously has an effect in relation to potential money that you're owed by the tenant is deposit compliance. So I mean, I'm dealing with one at the moment. I mean, you'll be glad to hear it's not in Nottingham, but in Bristol, 6 tenants, they've paid a £6,500 deposit between them. I mean, there's 8 students. They've paid a £6,500 deposit between them. The deposit was taken in, I think, in 2018. The tenancy was signed up in February 2019, and the deposit was protected 2 days before the tenancy started in July 2019. So the 30-day limit has been breached by quite a long way. Ultimately, they're on the hook. Luckily for them, there's only one tenancy, but they're on the hook for 18 grand. So when you're chasing someone for 3 months worth of rent, is it worth chasing them when they can chase you for 18 grand? Probably not. So
what are the forms you have to have filled out then?
So in terms of the really important ones, in terms of what we're discussing, the how to rent guide, the gas safety, absolutely important, the EPC important, but they don't stop the validity of the tenancy. So they're important, but the important ones in relation to what I'm saying is the deposit protection. Have you protected it within 30 days of receipt? Have you given a copy of the prescribing information to include the scheme leaflet, not only to the tenant, but potentially also to the parents, because in a lot of cases, the parents will be the person that paid the deposit. So they're really important, because if you don't do that within 30 days of receiving that money, then the penalty applies. So
what's the leaflet?
The scheme leaflet. So each of the schemes has deposit compliance is so complex, John. I think people who may have been on my courses before would have heard me say I would never take a deposit in a million years. But the scheme leaflet varies from scheme to scheme. So the DPS scheme leaflet is the 4 pages of really tightly packed writing. Which,
terms and conditions.
Terms and conditions, yeah. But don't forget, those terms and conditions get updated. So the latest one, I think, is June 2018 from memory. Well, I've got an agent who's been taken to court because they actually served the wrong version. They served the one from May 2015. Now, all they did is that they didn't realise it had been updated and then just served them the version they had on their computer. Well, sadly, that was the wrong version, because a lot of things have happened in that 3-year period, hence why the terms and conditions were updated. So the scheme leaflet is really important. So that's one for the DPS. If you use My Deposits, it has a scheme leaflet, and the same way if you use the TDS, the dispute service, they have their own scheme leaflet. So deposit compliance is quite complex in what you need to give to a tenant. So you just need to really make sure that you've given all the information to them if you're trying to chase them for rent arrears. Because if you're chasing them for rent arrears, the first thing that they generally do is they go off and seek legal advice. If they go off and seek legal advice, then these are the things that people like me would be looking at, because I'm pretty aware that lots of landlords and agents don't really understand what they're doing. So just be wary of that. If you are going to be chasing full rents, just be wary that you've got to be confident that all your ducks are in a row, so you're able to defend any questions of non-compliance.
There's a question. Yeah, sorry. Just a question here. What will happen in terms of end of tenancy inspections and deposit returns? Will we be allowed to do the inspections, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, without replaying all the things that I've discussed on previous webinars, the current legislation, as the Coronavirus Regulations 2020, don't actually restrict you moving in and out of home. So in theory, to end a tenancy and to do a checkout, you still have the legal right to go there, because you can't do a checkout from home. It's impossible, I assume, unless you've got a video recorder or whatever it's going to be. So you can go to a property, do a checkout from a legal perspective, and you're allowed to do that. The law allows you to do that. Now, that's a law I fully accept morally, and from a guidance perspective, what do you want to be doing? That's entirely up to you. You have to put that equation into your own head and decide what you want to do. Now, each of the schemes has given a little bit more flexibility in relation to to deductions. So they normally say that if you don't deal with deductions or an agreement within 10 days of the tenancy ending, a tenant can raise a dispute. So if I moved out of a property today, being the 29th of April, the deposit schemes say I can't raise a dispute until around the 8th of May. Now, lots of you will go, actually, we're not even going to visit the property in that 10-day period, Daryl, so we're not going to do anything. Well, that's what the schemes have said. We're going to allow a bit more flexibility. They're going to say, look, we can say, actually, the reason why the agent's not able to agree deductions is they've not been to visit the property yet. So the TDS, my deposits, and the DPS would give you a bit more flexibility, but they don't give you months. They'll probably just give you a couple of weeks. So at some stage, if the tenancy ends, you will need to go and visit it to decide whether or not that deposit is allowed to be returned in relation to damage. I don't know if that answers the question, Adela.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know. Matthew, does that answer your question?
No, so is it?
We've lost Matthew.
Yeah. Any others?
No, I think that's it. I can't think.
There's nothing else, Adela? Anyway, I'll press the record button, so I will hit the turn off button in relation to, and I'll send you the link.
Can you just, sorry, can you just mention the training tomorrow, because you're doing training course tomorrow for members as well?
Yeah, tomorrow is money claim online. I think it's, I can't remember what time it is now. Is it 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock?
No, 11:30, isn't it?
Is it 11:30? Okay, apologies on time. I've got webinars coming out of my ears. Yeah, so there's one tomorrow, money claim online. So I think John mentioned it earlier regarding debt recovery. So possession claim online. This is about Section 8 service. Apologies. So possession and a money claim, which together is possession claim online. So we're doing that tomorrow, which may not be so relevant to the student lets. So, but if you have a working tenant and you serve notice upon them, and that notice is coming to an end shortly, then I will show you how to complete the forms online tomorrow at a time which I will need to confirm. I thought it was 1 o'clock for some reason.
It's at 11 o'clock tomorrow.
Oh, is it 11 o'clock? Apologies. Yeah, 11 o'clock. But I better get up early then.
It's it's titled How to Complete the Court Forms for a Section 8 Online.
Yeah, so possession claim online, as people may know, POLCO, as I call it.
I think that's it. I think we're done. Any other questions? Well, if anybody has any questions, please just email myself or Giles, and we'll make sure we get back to you.
Brilliant, Adela. Thanks a lot. Good day, everyone.
Right, thank you.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
This conference will now be